watching India Today Global with me, Ishita Mitra, and the big story we track today is the Quad Summit. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met the US President Joe Biden and attended Quad Leaders Summit in Wilmington, Delaware as a part of his 3-day visit to the US. Now, the summit was held against a backdrop of two wars. You have Israel-Hamas war and, of course, Russia-Ukraine war and, of course, aggressive China in the South China Sea. Now, it was a farewell summit for both Fumio, Kishida and President Biden, and the underlying message was very clear that Quad is here to stay. So now I'm being joined by Swasti Rao. She's a research fellow at Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. She's been someone who's been closely monitoring Prime Minister Modi's US visit. So thank you, Swasti, for joining us on India Today Global. I want to begin by asking you that the relationship between US and India, it has been growing, whether it's economic sector, whether it's defense or space, and it's even been called, the defining relationship.
Of course, so this is basically the most fundamental question to actually delve on as to how has US-India bilateral relationship seen the kind of unprecedented and rather unbelievable progress that it has. So on the one hand, the binding logic is very clear, which is that we have more and more shared interests, in converging. So that is one real reason why we see this convergence. When I say shared interest, of course, this is on definitely our views on China. This is our views on how do we uphold a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And ultimately, one has to understand that all this US interest that you see in India today is also stemming from the fact that an empowered India, a strong defense industrial base, in India is actually in the long-term interest of the US. Okay, so this is somewhere the points that I would probably say that set the tone and tenor of the relationship. And I think if I go forward, I would say that the US-India bilateral relationship is also a good example, that even though India remains multi-aligned, because we always like to uphold our multi-alignment, but this multi-alignment is certainly not an equal distribution. And this is a statement. I have been making it for a long time now. And New Delhi today has the strategic realism to keep to national interests first. We talk to everybody. We have historic partners. We have new partners. But we also know very well which is that partner to substantively deepen ties with. And that is what you see in the US-India relationship. Now, the joint statement with the US, I think, is a case in point because it underscores just how crucial the India-US bilateral relationship is going to be when it comes to actually securing the entire world. And you called it rightly the most defining relationship of the new century, of the 21st century. So I think with respect to the Quad, I think it is here to stay. It is very clear. We have been speaking about the Quad, discussing the Quad, but I think what really fuels this dynamism in Quad is the fact that there is a bipartisan consensus in the US when it comes to India. There is also more and more convergence on how and what kind of a role, India can really play when it comes to global issues. Okay, one being the Ukraine war, the other being the Middle Eastern theater, and then also about what is going to be India's role in the emerging digital order. So these are the kind of expansive things that I'd say that really give the tone and tenor. And let's not forget that, Indians also happen to be the biggest diaspora in the US, and the people-to-people ties have been thriving and continue to thrive. And ultimately, I think the US attitude on China will also, regardless of who comes, to White House, we will see some sort of a fine-tuning happening, whether it's a Kamala administration or a Trump administration, about how they look at China. In the Biden administration, we did see that there was a continuity, especially when it came to China. But I think that is also going to be one of the factors that is going to impact what kind of friendshoring, what kind of investments, what kind of a willingness to transfer technology, what kind of, all those things happen with respect to India.
There's a statement given by New Delhi in which it emphasized that it is minimizing conflict and division while leveraging democratic values even as it pursues developmental objectives. Now, this is a direct reference to the way China has been operating in the region, and also Prime Minister Modi clearly specified that the grouping is not against anyone. So, also not overemphasizing on the importance of China. So how do you see these two statements?
Well, yes, I mean, like I said, that even though we, in the Quad, especially in the Quad group, if you see, India has always remained to be China agnostic, right? I mean, we would rather not name China, but everybody knows that it's basically it's basically Quad is basically a coordinated strategic response to the unilateral change of status quo by China after Xi Jinping has come to power, and especially all the wolf warrior diplomacy and all the 9-line claims and all that the China is doing in the Himalayas with us. So while on the one hand, China agnosticism is going to continue, and this is a point that a lot of people, find to criticize India and say that, but India is not really out there to name China. But what is the point? As long as you're doing something, as long as you're doing what it takes, I don't think it matters whether you're calling it something or not, because let's also understand that if at all we get into that name calling, we are also sort of letting ourselves play into the Chinese narrative of Quad being a nation, NATO, and blah blah blah. So I think it somewhere reaffirms. I think you must have heard that the Prime Minister was also very categorical in understating that. In emphasizing that Quad is not really against anybody. That also reaffirms that India stands for an inclusive order, right? I mean, we say free, open, and an inclusive Indo-Pacific, which means that if tomorrow China were to mend its ways and, behave better with us and not really stab us in the back like they did in 2020, I mean, we would be happy to sort of also speak to China in the same way. However, coming to the main thing, India believes in building collaborative frameworks and not alliances. So this is also a kind of a signaling that for a lot of people, because there are a lot of critics, who would perhaps interpret India and US deepening as some sort of an alliance building of sorts.
All right, all the three countries, whether it was Japan or Australia or the US, the leaders of all these three countries hailed India for its leadership role in the global south as well as its experience in the Indian Ocean. So how do you see, India leading Quad in the future?
Well, I mean, as far as leadership is concerned, I think when it comes to Quad, everybody understands that Quad it is collaborative, and when India comes to Quad, of course, India comes as the voice of the global South as well, right? So whether it is about making the vaccine distribution more egalitarian, whether it is about reforming the multilateral system, whether it is about issues on clean energy, for example, or connectivity, for example, I think all these things are entwined when you're looking at the Quad, when you're looking at these initiatives, the joint statements. I mean, you obviously understand that Quad is not a standalone activity out there, but you need to connect these dots with a whole host of other things that are happening with our partners in the region. So, for example, I mentioned the IPMTA, of course, but then there's also the IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And if you see that India has joined 3 out of its 4 pillars, the last pillar, which is on free trade and all of that, India still has reservations on, but the other ones, which are on clean energy, which is on climate adaptation mitigation, I mean, you would see that these are things which are very, very close to how India has been pursuing the interests of the global South, because for example, our point and our commitment when it comes to phasing out versus phasing down of fossil fuels. So I think all these things, India being at the high table, speaks not only from international interest, but also as the voice of the other developing countries. And in that sense, I think India will definitely take a leadership role. And I guess what India has shown whether it was the COVID-19 pandemic, or what India has shown during the G20 years, or the way India has kept its very active neutrality intact when it came to the Ukraine war. Okay, I think that clearly goes on to show that India is extremely capable of actually providing leadership to a world which is more fragmented, which is which is talking less and less to each other, where the hybrid threats are growing, and for sort of enabling that role of India, I guess these strategic partnerships are very relevant, and that is why you see the kind of momentum that you're seeing today.
Correct. As I mentioned before, that there was a clear message by all the 4 leaders saying that Quad is here to stay, to assist, to partner, and of course to contribute to the global good. So, given that these countries engage in a range of issues, what's the future like for Quad, keeping China aside?
future of Quad without China, I guess, one has to understand that we sometimes tend to give way too much importance to one factor, which is China. Of course, China is not the end of the world, while it does, of course, help India and US come together and coordinate better. But end of the day, the objective is not just to counter China. I think that would be a very, very reductionist way of looking at a platform like Quad. I think the strategic objectives of Quad is to keep the Indo-Pacific region, which is a massive, maritime domain, free and open. And free and open Indo-Pacific is about a variety of issues. Free and open Indo-Pacific, free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific is where, you have all these sea lanes of communication, you have all the world trade passing from. We are seeing that in the Red Sea, the way piracy has returned, for example. I mean, there is a situation in the world where we require better coordination in order to safeguard our own interests, right? So in the short term, perhaps this is China, maybe in the middle term as well, because we don't really see the Communist Party of China going anywhere, and neither do we see their nefarious activities going anywhere. I mean, I would wish them better, but at least we do not see that happening in the short term. And but we also know that we need to engage. I think the US engages China, India engages China, because in a very complex, globalized, entwined world, we have genuine economic interests as well. But when you're speaking about Quad, why is it futuristic? Is that it is not just about countering China. It is about creating connectivity where you have, clean, which is where you have better financing for clean energy, where you have better, communications technology, flowing, where you have a better network of, developing frameworks for blue economies, marine economies. This is where the future is. And Indo-Pacific is where, who really sort of does these things in the Indo-Pacific today will, somewhere guide where the world is going tomorrow.
As you mentioned, that Quad is not just an anti-China bloc. The countries have cooperated on various issues, including addressing pandemic, disease, and responding to natural disasters, and of course, strengthening maritime security. So at this summit, of course, we also saw a lot of agreements being signed, including Cancer Moonshot and Maritime Awareness and Training Initiative. So could you please outline the outcome of this summit for us?
One of the things that really stands out when it comes to the joint statement, and now we have both the joint statements, at least the core joint statement is very comprehensive. It starts actually with the Cancer Moonshot, and you can see that I think it's building on this wonderful experience that the Quad countries had when it came to the COVID vaccine, distribution, and especially India's role there. And so I think the Cancer Moonshot is about sort of, strengthening the fact that we are very serious about eradicating these kind of illnesses from the world, and what kind of a role that that supply chain and all the R&D can play in the sector. So I think that's it's testimony, bears testimony to that fact. The other thing I saw was the humanitarian relief and disaster management, and of course that for India's public diplomacy, this has been one of the most important pillars, that no matter where there's a disaster in the world, where humanitarian assistance is sought in the world, India has always risen up to occasion. I mean, you can just go on thinking of countries, even those countries with whom we do not share a very smooth relationship, like, for example, Turkey. Now, there was an earthquake, and then India was one of the first to send humanitarian assistance, whether it's Ukraine, Myanmar, I mean, you just name it, India has always been present. So I guess I was not surprised to see the mention there, because that's one of the most important pillars that India actually stands committed to. The other is, of course, maritime. I already mentioned the Maritime Initiative for Training in the Indo-Pacific, and this is also about having this this new ship observer mission for 2025, etc. This was launched. But I think the joint statement also rightly mentioned the quality infrastructure development, and how we can sort of identify certain ports and develop it. Because see, end of the day, one has to understand that if you want to really make globalization work in a way that you have resilience of supply chains, ultimately this is going to be about multimodal connectivity, right? And you see that the US is present in the Indo-Pacific region and also elsewhere in the world under its PGII, which was earlier called the Build Back Better World Initiative, where if you see there's just so much focus on infrastructure. Now, I think this is again very useful, a useful conversation to have, because while on the one hand, it is very easy to see this, to say that we want better connectivity, but on the other hand, especially after COVID and the Ukraine war, and now what is happening in West Asia, there is a situation where we find it very difficult to de-risk capital. So how do you sort of, facilitate and mobilize investments to actually do what is required to do? Then, of course, one very important factor, in my opinion, is the critical and emerging technologies. I think it was last year that the Quad partners did launch a kind of an initiative where they deployed a first open radio access network, which is called the RAN, in the Pacific. Okay, and this is in Palau. And what we then saw that in this 1 year, the Quad has also pledged approximately $20 million for it. And now we would see, like, for example, I said that there are enabling frameworks, there are things that we have agreed to, and then there are things that we've pledged also. But the point is, how do you de-risk capital, and how do you see that things actually fall in line and don't really just evaporate, in thin air? Of course, climate change and clean energy is very much there. And I was also happy to see that there's a mention of Ukraine, there's a mention of Red Sea. And with respect to Ukraine, I think it's very, very clear that the West has also become more accommodative of the fact that India remains multi-aligned. India has a special relationship with Russia, even though it's changing on its own accord in the aftermath of the war. But at the same time, whenever the time is right, India will have a very important role to play in innovative peace building, because India stands for innovative solutions.
You mentioned this specific thing, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, that all the four leaders welcomed the finalization of a memorandum for cooperation on semiconductor supply chains contingency. Now, semiconductor industry is being touted as the industry of the future, and Prime Minister Modi very recently said that, he talked about India's emergence as a global semiconductor powerhouse. So how do we look at this development in the light of this summit?
Yes, I mean, if you carefully see, one of the things that really stands out in India's emerging strategic cooperation and strategic relationship with its close partners is an understanding, or is an agreement on semiconductors. We saw it happening under ISET with the US. There's also with the European Union that we signed something called the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, and the TTC recently signed an MOU on semiconductors. Similarly, I mean, you can see that there is a lot of push in the world to actually make the semiconductor supply chain more resilient and safer, and you see a lot of friendshoring happening in that regard. I think it's very clear, because we do see that there is an over-reliance on certain actors. And in fact, even if you look at, for example, Taiwan, the Biden administration passed something called a SHIELD Act, which was actually didn't really go down very well in Taiwan, because they really enjoyed this monopoly over the semiconductors. But I think these little aberrations will continue, because of course these things lie at the heart of so much of what is happening in the world. But what you have to somewhere understand is that we are standing at this crossroads, and this is like a larger understanding, that we are actually standing at the crossroad of an emerging global digital order, right? And whoever partakes in this emerging global digital order is going to also control later on the global economic order and the global security order. So for that, of course, we cannot go alone, because the global digital order by definition is something which is very difficult to ascertain. It kind of transcends national boundaries. You see the power of data, you see the power of telecommunications and everything, and all the AI, etc. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to critical and emerging technology, the kind of relationship patterns that we see in India today are basically going to determine what is India's place in the future. And when I say the future, I mean the global digital order, because and we need to co-develop norms, we need to co-develop regulations, and we need to also friendshore in time. So the semiconductor bit is basically getting the friendshoring in time, and it will take time. It will take a bit. It's an easier said than done feat, but I'm sure that we'll be able to get there. Yes.
And this was a farewell summit for both Joe Biden and Fumio Kishida. So, could you explain to us what their role has been, briefly, and their legacy both the leaders are leaving behind?
Most, if you even notice this particular joint statement of the court, it starts in where this plurilateral has reached in the last 4 years alone, right? And part of that has obviously got to do with how President Biden actually doubled down on these efforts, despite the fact that there was a pandemic, despite the fact that there was a Russia-Ukraine war, and despite the fact that we had serious, divergences when it came to, so many foreign policy issues, despite the fact that there was a Pannu controversy, which continues, right? I mean, even now there's so much noise about how this is going to impact or is it not going to impact. So I think one important thing has happened during Biden administration is that it has become much more clearer now that there is indeed a bipartisan support to India. With respect to Biden per se, I think Prime Minister Modi and Biden's personal bonhomie has also gone a long way in sort of cementing this very crucial strategic relationship we've had. And if you just see the sheer number of times that Prime Minister Modi has actually reached out to Biden, and vice versa, when he has come to India, when, the Prime Minister has gone to the US, or if they've met elsewhere in the world, I mean, you really see that this is built on a true, a sense of friendship. And this is, while one of the things which was very clear was the gesture, right, that India did by letting Prime Minister Biden host the summit, which was actually India's turn to host, just as a gesture, because he would be stepping down as president very soon, and then we are going to be probably readying ourselves for a new administration in the US. Also, I think Biden has been very instrumental. I think a lot of people do not understand that Biden has been very instrumental. The Biden administration has been very instrumental in really cementing what we mean by this world-class defense industry cooperation. It was under the Biden administration that we signed at least three main things. One was, of course, the ISET, which is on critical and emerging technologies. The other is Indus-X, which talks about innovation. And the third is SOSA, which is, security of supplies agreement. Okay, and if you take these things into account, you understand from a relatively more transactionalist approach that the Trump administration had shown towards India and towards the rest of the world. I think it was the Biden administration when it got very clear that they need to sort of step out of that and look at India in a more strategic manner, not just a cost benefit, kind of a transactionalist manner. Even though I am personally of the opinion that the US is doing that not because it is trying to do us some favor, but like I said initially in my remarks, that the US is doing that because it is absolutely in the US strategic interest to have an empowered and a strong India in the Indo-Pacific as a partner. So I think Biden administration was instrumental in sort of cementing that, also at a time when the world situation was extremely fragile and difficult, and we had so many divergences. So I would probably see this trend to continue.
Professor, just my last question to you is, India is going to host the next Quad Summit in 2025. So what can we expect from that?
Well, I think as far as the next Quad Summit is concerned, like I said, that there's this ship observer port, or this particular agreement that we agreed to. I mean, this thing that we launched. I'm sorry, there's this new thing in the maritime domain that we launched that we would be probably seeing for the first time. Like I said, that India takes a lot of pride in the IFC IOR. It definitely is a model that really stands out when it comes to fusing maritime domain awareness and information. And I think you would perhaps see, more development on that part. Like I said, that real-time linking of information is easier said than done because it requires a lot of technical changes. I think when it comes to India would always also be sort of interested in all the climate goals. Like I said, that India has been standing for that. The Prime Minister has been saying that we need a pro-planet people approach, to all of this. And I think by then, the kind of development that we have seen bilaterally particularly in ISET, especially when it comes to the digital order, to AI, to quantum, and these kind of, semiconductors. We have signed an MOU on semiconductors as well. All of that will probably start to bear a little bit more fruit so that you have more clarity on where this is going. But for sure, I think out of the other three, Prime Minister Modi is going to be here for another few years. So obviously, whoever then comes would be new entrants. And perhaps that is also another reason why India is seen as somebody who can provide leadership, also because Prime Minister Modi has stayed on while the others might change. So I think that is something that I'm looking forward to. And ultimately, yes, like I said, that the core inclusivity agenda that India looks at these plurilaterals with, I think those are going to sort of ultimately stay on, and we would probably see, basically building on whatever we have done so far.